Let's go on with preparation. This is what they say about half of the city. Quote, one part goes into the evil servant class, while the other part the Lord uses to make up the faithful and wise servant class. Remember in the Finished Mystery video we talked about the city there, that they say that the wine press is trodden outside the city, Revelation 14. The city is Bethel in New York. Right. They're going along with that kind of interpretation.
Right, yeah.
So the city is headquarters basically, and the evil servant class are the bad guys.
The ones that
were loyal to Russell, really, is what it works out when you do your historical research. Those are the evil servant. And the ones that are going with the new light, they are aligning themselves with the faithful and wise servant. What's the exile here? The quote, they join with and go down with the enemy organization.
Yeah, that's the exile.
The remaining ones of the people, they will not be cut off from the city. Quote, surely signifies that the Elisha-Jehu work shall never fail, but that those who are permitted to engage in that work maintain their integrity, and shall forever be with the Lord in the temple or holy organization of Jehovah.
I think you have to think about what Zechariah and the people would have thought about going into exile and half the people out of the city. They're not going to think what the Watchtower thinks.
So what are we going to do with the mountain of the olive trees? Let's find out what Rutherford did with the mountain of the olive trees. Quote, the great universal organization of Jehovah God, on which Jehovah's feet stand, and from which point he supervises the operation of his army. Now this was the text that caused me the most consternation, because either I take it literally, seriously, and that Jerusalem is Jerusalem, and people are people, and women are women, houses are houses, and the Mount of Olives is the Mount of Olives.
Yes.
In which case, if you don't believe in the second coming being visible, you have a real problem here.
Yeah.
Because this sounds very much like texts we're familiar with from the New Testament.
Yeah. So they actually focus on the Mount of the olive trees, but they don't believe it's that mountain which exists.
Which exists.
Still.
And Zechariah knew existed because he saw it every day, probably.
Yeah. So they pass by the parts. So it's interesting what they highlight and what they miss.
Yes.
So in this case, they kind of just very quickly pass by the idea of Jehovah's feet being on the mountain, because that's not going to go down very well with Jehovah's Witnesses. And I have a little story about that. I think this was around the time David wasn't going, but I was still going, and I worked for my parents. I worked for my dad. So I saw my mother on a regular basis. And she told me about being out in the door-to-door work and some Christian quoting, just quoting Zechariah 14, 1-7 to her. And she denied that it existed, the verse that he was talking about, because he mentioned this one about Jehovah's feet landing on the mountain. That's not in the Bible. You know, how ridiculous. But then she said he took her Bible, opened it up to Zechariah 14, and read it to her from her own Bible. And she was stumped, like she just didn't know what to do. So she was kind of asking me, I think, to ask David.
To ask me, who's not going to the meetings anymore?
Yeah. As to what do we do with that? What does the Watchtower say about this? What does it mean? And it was a shocker for me, although David had talked to me about this. These things I had never noticed before, and even when we talked about it in Scripture or read their books, those were the things that were just sort of quickly gone past, and then you don't focus on it. But if someone forces you to look at it, you have to do something with that.
So what did we do with it? Well, we had to make a decision as to whether we would trust the Watchtower or God himself to be able to speak clearly.
Yeah. I think it was a breakthrough, too, for me in understanding why Christians held positions that they held.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that it talks about Jehovah's feet on the mountain, the second coming, you have Jesus coming down on that mountain. I started to see where they were getting
even if you didn't
some
believe
of their teachings. Yeah, at least I could understand where they were getting them from.
I think also that we should reference here that we've already done a series on Jehovah's appearing. This is not the only text that indicates that Jehovah's glory will be demonstrated. He will appear personally.
Yeah.
So if you go to the Divine Names videos, you'll see quite a bit about that. In the name Jehovah itself is the implication that he appears.
Yeah.
And that he talks personally. So he appears literally and talks personally. And those are notions that were not clear to us. Well, they were impossible.
Yeah.
The way we viewed God.
And again, it's a matter of what is emphasized in the Watchtower's literature and at their meetings, and what is just quickly skipped over.
Yeah. All right. Let's return to their explanation in preparation. About half of the mountain will actually be moved to the north. Quote, Jehovah's royal family, the Christ, now in kingdom power. That's a notion not familiar to modern Jehovah's Witnesses, isn't it?
Who's included
originally,
in
in Russell's view and in Rutherford's for a few decades, the Christ included the 144,000.
Yeah.
So that's a scary thought. The anointed are, it's not just Messiah Christ, whose name means anointed, it's also the 144,000.
And witnesses they used to always like to say, we're teaching the same thing that we taught from the beginning. But that was news to me, that Christ included the 144,000 when I read that. Which book was that? That was, it was like a booklet that they really outlined that. Do you remember?
This is the one about the tabernacle shadows?
Oh, yeah.
Tabernacle shadows, and also in the book Atonement, one of the 6 volumes of Russell, yeah. How about north here? What does north mean? A superior position as the capital of Zion Jehovah's organization. So north doesn't mean north.
Doesn't mean direction.
Half of it to the south. Half of it to the south. And all they say about that is his universal organization.
Yeah, so they both mean the same thing.
So
basically.
Would you say they're organization minded by 1933? They cannot see anything but the organization.
Yeah.
If that's not idolatry, I don't know.
And they cannot read passages of scripture without looking for themselves in it.
Yeah. How about the valley of the mountains? Okay, quote, while in the valley, Jehovah's Witnesses are protected by the north half, Christ, and the south half, his angels of Jehovah's organization. Okay, we go on. No precious light. Quote, this period of time when there is no clear light seems to have had its beginning about the year 1914 and continued until the end of the 1260-day period, to wit, I love that, to wit, September 1922, a time of much talk and conjecture and personal interpretation on the part of God's covenant people. The mystery of God not being, get this, the mystery of God not then, in 1922, being finished.
Wow. Yeah.
Well, hadn't they just said 5 years before that the mystery was finished?
Yeah. Also, when you're reading that, because I'm looking at the original, text here, the part that they completely skip by here, it talks about an earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. This gives you, if you're going to go by the rules that we talked about in the Humpty Dumpty series, it's giving you a person that existed and a place that existed.
And a literal earthquake.
Yeah.
That actually happened. I don't know if many ex-witnesses are aware of this. There was an earthquake that tradition remembered in the days of Uzziah. It's actually used as a dating point. Check it out. Yeah. Check out the word Uzziah in your concordance and you'll see what I mean. It's a dating point in history, as if it was so important that they marked time from it.
Yeah.
Well, that earthquake is commemorated here. And it's a literal earthquake. So to go from a reference to a past literal earthquake to some spiritual earthquake happening in the decade of the 1920s.
Yeah, it's Humpty Dumpty.
Humpty Dumpty indeed. So in part 3, we'll take up the rest of preparation's explanation.